Welcome to the debate. Today, we are focusing on really one of the most critical domains for the future of the economy: education and workforce reform. Now, this goes far beyond just, arguing about K-12 test scores. We're actually talking about foundational structural questions, the true cost of higher education, the relevance of credentials, and ultimately how we ensure broad, sustainable opportunity in what is, let's face it, a rapidly evolving job market. So, as we analyze the material today, the central tension seems pretty stark. Should our reform efforts primarily focus on empowering individuals through, let's call it, competition and choice? Or, alternatively, must we focus our resources on strengthening foundational public institutions through deep systemic investment and equity?
Characterized by equitable funding and comprehensive whole child supports, well, that's the only mechanism scalable enough to achieve true broad opportunity. We really need that large-scale public investment to overcome some pretty entrenched disadvantages.
And I'll be presenting the case for, frankly, radically empowering families and employers directly. We need to utilize market mechanisms, skills first pathways to drive accountability, inject relevance, and provide the speed necessary to match student potential with economic needs. My position essentially is that bureaucracy is the enemy of opportunity here. So my core thesis is this: reform must empower families and employers. It has to ensure that the funding dollar follows the student and the worker to effective options, prioritizing competition to rapidly drive up quality. In K-12, this means, reducing the layers of institutional control. We should be championing growth in public charter schools, for instance, and expanding mechanisms like education savings accounts or ESAs. Now, for the audience who might be unfamiliar with the details, ESAs, they essentially allow a portion of public education funds to be used flexibly by families for approved educational expenses beyond just tuition, so everything from tutoring to curriculum materials. This freedom of movement, where funding follows the student, it really forces existing systems to adapt or, frankly, improve. And we see the real-world success of this kind of model in high-performing charter sectors. Just look at the data coming out of Boston, New York City, D.C., showing large, immediate gains for disadvantaged students, particularly in early literacy and math. We also, I believe, need to anchor K-12 in non-negotiable academic basics: early literacy, foundational math, backed by rigorous, transparent accountability measures like, say, A to F school ratings. And then for the economy, we absolutely must accelerate workforce relevance. That means expanding apprenticeships, short-cycle credentials. And furthermore, states have got to remove these antiquated occupational licensing barriers. The universal recognition reforms we've seen in Arizona and Utah demonstrate that we can ease interstate mobility and speed entry into good jobs without compromising safety. At the end of the day, competition lifts quality, and skills-first pathways offer a faster and, frankly, cheaper route to good employment than the current four-year default.
I'm just not convinced that destabilizing the system like that is the path towards system-wide opportunity. The high-performing choice options you cite, whether they're charters or specific private programs, they are often capacity constrained, right? They serve a small fraction of the students. A strong public system backed by serious, equitable funding and wraparound services, that's the only scalable equalizer. So we must focus targeted funding toward high-poverty schools. We have to address historical resource deficits. And we must also support universal early childhood education. Look, this isn't just theory. We've seen lasting population-level literacy and math gains following comprehensive pre-K expansions in places like Oklahoma, New Jersey, and D.C. This is about building the foundation for every single child. Furthermore, systemic quality really rests on the teacher workforce.
We need massive investment in pay, in preparation, mentoring, class size relief, including targeted debt relief for those who commit to high-need subjects or regions. We should also be fully implementing evidence-based instructional methods, specifically the science of reading. Look at Mississippi, a state that was historically, near the bottom of national rankings, managed a significant turnaround. How? By systematically training every teacher in phonics and structured literacy. Now that's a systemic win, wouldn't you say? Not really a market solution. And then for post-secondary education, we advocate for genuinely affordable pathways. That includes models like free community college tracks, similar to Tennessee Promise or Michigan Reconnect. But, and this is crucial, only if those programs maintain strict guardrails against predatory for-profits. The public system I maintain is the only mechanism that can achieve true scale and ensure that resources aren't just siphoned off by low-quality providers.
That's a compelling argument for stability. I grant you that. But I would frame the current reality quite differently. The dissatisfaction of families, especially those, locked into failing schools, that's a direct result of bureaucracy and, let's be honest, legacy rules that consistently block innovation within existing entrenched systems. Competition isn't the goal itself. Excellence is the goal. And choice is the necessary pressure mechanism to actually achieve it. Think about it. When funding follows the child, the entire system is forced to adapt. For example, the highest performing charter networks, they achieve their results not just by cream skimming, as some suggest, but by implementing innovations like extended school days, high-dosage tutoring, flexible staffing, things that traditional systems really struggle to adopt because of contractual rigidity. Choice allows for a better match between specific student needs, say a child needing an accelerated STEM curriculum or one needing specialized trauma-informed care, and the provider best suited to deliver that.
I apologize, but I just don't buy that competition scales effectively to serve the vast majority of students. I mean, sure, the idea of family agency is powerful, rhetorically, but we have to address the tangible risks that come with unchecked choice mechanisms. The data, I think, is pretty clear. Vouchers and ESAs often drain essential per-pupil resources from neighborhood schools. And these neighborhood schools, which, let's remember, serve 85 to 90% of students, they're left to cope with less funding while simultaneously serving the costliest populations. That leads to potential segregation and, yes, the risk of cream skimming, the easiest to educate students. The material also highlights, I think, a massive vulnerability in the choice model: special education protections. Private schools receiving public funds through vouchers often do not adhere to the same comprehensive federal mandates regarding special education services that public schools must follow.
We simply cannot afford to destabilize the only comprehensive system that is designed and, importantly, legally obligated to serve every child, including those with severe disabilities.
Okay, but that risk of destabilization, it has to be weighed against the reality of institutional inertia, doesn't it? If we just wait for the entire system to somehow magically turn around, generations of students will have missed their chance. We must accelerate change. And speaking of acceleration, let's maybe pivot to accountability in post-secondary pathways, which is critical if we expand access, as you're proposing. Look, I agree we need accountability, absolutely. But my focus is squarely on achieving cost discipline through outcomes-based funding and rigorous program-level return on investment, ROI, transparency. If we just increase funding substantially as you advocate without structural changes that force providers to justify their programs based on actual student success, well, we simply risk bureaucratic bloat and incredibly slow program turnaround. My worry is that just pumping in more funding merely supports the status quo, and it's an expensive status quo where non-completion rates are far too high. We have to demand clear, program-level earnings versus debt data. So instead of simply guaranteeing access, we should be using funding models that actively reward institutions for graduating students on time, for closing equity gaps, and for ensuring those graduates actually earn a sustainable wage relative to the debt they accrue.
Okay, that focus on ROI is essential, I agree, but it cannot be the only metric. I'm sorry, I just don't buy that simply expanding access through, quote, free college designs automatically guarantees successful completion, regardless of the ROI metric you apply. The material itself notes that these designs risk poor completion without strong structural supports, and this is precisely where investment matters. Students need robust advising, they need intrusive mentoring, emergency aid to cover non-tuition costs like childcare or housing. Look, if we make tuition free, but then fail to invest in the holistic supports necessary for a low-income student to actually stay enrolled and succeed, well, we've only solved half the problem, haven't we? And we also need robust quality assurance in the workforce pathways you advocate for. These short-cycled credentials and apprenticeships, they must have meaningful quality and earnings metrics attached. Because without strong guardrails, these skills-first pathways can be patchy, sometimes offering little more than low-wage, dead-end jobs.
I agree, we need quality assurance, which is exactly why the model must be employer-led. That's the real beauty of an apprenticeship moonshot. You're training people for guaranteed jobs with a wage built in from day one. This model, particularly expanding youth apprenticeships in high-demand fields like IT or advanced manufacturing, it acts as a powerful bridging move. It aligns education directly with the labor market and, crucially, moves at the speed of industry, which is invariably faster than decades-long systemic restructuring. But let's bring it back to the philosophical divide for a moment, this idea of scalability versus speed of implementation. We do need to acknowledge, I think, a key vulnerability on the systemic side. Systemic reform, while noble in its intent, is historically slow and very susceptible to accountability slippage.
And that brings us back to what I see as the indispensable advantage of systemic reform: scale, equity, and evidence-based supports. You simply cannot solve systemic inequality with localized, boutique solutions. Strategies like universal early childhood education, mandatory teacher professional development and instructional science, comprehensive teacher debt forgiveness, these can lift outcomes system-wide. This is necessary for broad opportunity precisely because it addresses the systemic barriers facing all students in a region. Relying on parents to navigate a complex, fragmented market of choice options, especially when those parents are low income or working multiple jobs, well, that places an unfair burden on those least able to shoulder it. Systemic investment removes those barriers for everyone, simultaneously.
But your systemic approach, while it definitely aims for scale, often founders on implementation speed, and let's face it, political short-termism. How do you actually guarantee the multi-year support necessary for the boring but essential follow-through on things like universal literacy implementation or comprehensive tutoring rollouts? History suggests that political will tends to fade within an election cycle or two. Reforms that empower the worker immediately, like the universal licensing recognition we discussed earlier, they offer immediate, tangible relief and faster entry to good jobs. So my question is pretty direct. Can your commitment to long-term, often expensive systemic support truly overcome the acute accountability slippage and the, frankly, glacial pace often found in large public sector reforms?
It requires continuous oversight, absolutely, and data-driven adaptation. But the alternative, fragmenting the system and risking resource dilution for the majority, that's unacceptable from an equity standpoint. The only way to ensure genuine equity is through a system that guarantees quality access for everyone everywhere.
Okay, so to summarize my position, empowering individual agency and aligning education directly with labor market needs, primarily via competition and choice, provides the necessary pressure and, yes, the speed for improvement. This approach, focused on clear ROI and reduced bureaucracy, offers poor families the kinds of options and responsiveness the affluent already possess.
I'll reaffirm that deep systemic investment, particularly in critical areas like early childhood and the teacher pipeline, coupled with strong civil rights and quality guardrails, that remains the essential foundation for ensuring equity and opportunity at a meaningful scale. Without this foundational investment, the system simply cannot function as the equalizer it absolutely must be.
I think both sides can probably agree on certain practical bridging ideas that the material highlights. For instance, implementing the science of reading statewide, backed by mandatory public reporting on student growth. That seems like a systemic reform that leverages proven evidence effectively.
Right. And similarly, tying public college funding explicitly to equitable completion rates and earnings-adjusted ROI, that's a way to introduce accountability into systemic institutions without relying solely on market fragmentation. So there's common ground there.
Exactly. Ultimately, the value of any path forward, I think we agree, should be judged by a shared scoreboard: third grade reading proficiency, closing subgroup gaps, completion rates, and clear, transparent earnings versus debt metrics. So the listener really has to weigh whether the risk of uneven quality, which is inherent in a more decentralized choice model, outweighs the risk of stagnant outcomes and institutional inertia, which can be inherent in entrenched systems, or, vice versa. That's the core question in determining the best path forward for broad opportunity.